Welcome to the Deep Dive, brought to you by Reformed Thinking. Today we're getting into a custom deep dive on a really monumental work of theological history. Jonathan Edwards's A History of the Work of Redemption.
It's a huge one, and it's not just a history book, It's Edwards charting all of history from the perspective of God's absolute sovereignty.
Right, so we're looking at his framework, specifically from the Reformation up to his own time in the 1700s.
That's it. Our mission here is to see how he accounts for the success Christ purchased. He's showing God's hand moving through time, even when there's this tremendous spiritual and physical conflict going on.
Okay, so we have four main parts to this.
Yep. The Reformation itself, then the really intense opposition it faced, some surprising successes of the gospel, and then finally he does this kind of report card on the state of the church in his day.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into the moment Edward says the forces of Antichrist fell halfway toward utter ruin.
A very dramatic starting point.
It is. So let's start with the Reformation itself. He calls it the pouring of the fifth vial.
Right. So the historical period we're talking about starts right after what he calls the dark time of the church. We're looking at around 1515 in Germany.
And the main figure is obviously Martin Luther.
Of course. But Edwards doesn't frame him as just a political figure. He says Luther was stirred to action by two things. First, the horrid practices of the popish clergy.
Things people could see with their own eyes.
Exactly. Corruption that shocked the conscience. And second, his really diligent, long study of the Holy Scriptures. That was the foundation for everything.
And those horrid practices, that's key, isn't it? It wasn't just some academic disagreement. It was visible corruption.
Oh, absolutely. The sale of indulgences, the immorality, the usurpation of authority, that's what drove Luther to so openly and, boldly criticize the whole system.
And the success at the start was pretty remarkable.
It was incredibly fast. He immediately got powerful allies, like the Elector of Saxony, who gave him political cover.
And it wasn't just him. Edwards is careful to credit the others.
He is. He points to the wide-ranging efforts of the other key reformers. You have Melanchthon, who sort of systematized the theology. You have Zwingli in Switzerland, and then, of course, John Calvin,
who Edward sees as one of the most eminent reformers of the whole era.
That's right. He sees it as this combined work of men who were both, spiritually gifted and just incredibly sharp intellectually.
And the geographic spread just shows how fast this thing moved.
It really does. It wasn't contained in Wittenberg. I mean, it just swept across the main states of Europe. You're talking about German princes, England, Scotland, Sweden, Denmark,
France, Poland, the Low Countries.
The list goes on. When you look at the initial scope, it's just staggering. At one point, historians think about half of what was known as Christendom, if you don't count the Greek church, was Protestant.
That is a massive shift in allegiance in a very short time.
It is. Edwards does make a sobering point, though. He notes that by his own time, the tide had pulled back a bit. He saw that the papists had regained some ground, so that initial proportion didn't completely hold.
But that initial shockwave? That's what he's focused on.
That's the key. And because the event was so overwhelming, he has to give it a theological interpretation. This is where he moves from just history to prophecy.
So this wasn't just a political revolt for him?
Not at all. He saw it as God gloriously reviving his church after this long, dark night of spiritual oppression. For Edwards, this is the moment where Antichrist, who had been gaining power for centuries, was swiftly and suddenly brought down.
And he anchors this in the book of Revelation.
He does. He links it directly to the pouring of the fifth vial. Revelation 16:10. The angel pours out his vial on the seat of the beast.
And the seat of the beast, for Edwards, that's the throne of the Pope.
Right. His actual authority, his dominion over the kingdoms of Europe, not just his spiritual claims, but his political power.
So the effect was immediate.
Instantaneous and debilitating to Rome's standing. The Pope's authority was just terribly shaken. He lost about half his dominions. But maybe even more critically, his influence was weakened even in the countries that stayed officially Catholic.
This is where he uses that image of the lion.
Yes, that striking image. He is as a lion that has lost his teeth. He might still have the shape and roar of a lion, but the power to enforce his will was largely gone.
Even in Catholic countries like France and Spain.
Especially there. They realized they didn't have to automatically bow to the Pope's political will anymore. They could negotiate. Sometimes they could just openly defy him.
A huge shift in the balance of power.
A massive one. And this leads to how the opposition responded. When the Pope and the clergy saw how much they'd lost, they were enraged.
So they tried to crush the Reformation immediately.
With every policy and strategy you can imagine. And yet, Their very complex strategies failed spectacularly. Edward sees this prophetically. He says their kingdom became full of darkness.
And darkness here isn't just ignorance, is it?
No, it's a divinely imposed confusion, an inability to make their plans work. It's like the Egyptians and the plagues who couldn't rise from their seats.
He connects it to the book of Job.
He does. Job chapter 5. He disappointeth the devices of the crafty. He says the enemies of God's people were so thwarted that they were made to gnaw their tongues for pain.
Which is just a physical picture of pure rage and disappointment.
Exactly. So the Reformation, for Edwards, was this sudden, glorious, divinely sanctioned blow right to the heart of anti-Christian rule. A huge turning point.
That sets the stage powerfully. The beast is wounded, but it's not dead, and a wounded beast is still dangerous.
Indeed. And despite that massive blow to Rome's authority, the work of redemption is never unopposed. The second the gospel gains ground, Satan mounts a resistance.
Organized, multi-front resistance.
That's right. So we need to look at the 5 main kinds of opposition that the Reformed Church faced. The first line of defense Rome tried was structural. They tried to stabilize the system by calling a general council.
The famous Council of Trent.
Right. Called shortly after Luther started, and it was an attempt to stabilize Catholic doctrine and polity against the Reformers.
And this was no small meeting.
Not at all. The Council of Trent, with all its intermissions, went on for 25 years. It was an epic attempt to redefine and solidify their position. You had cardinals, archbishops, bishops, innumerable clergy.
And their one goal was to crush the Reformation by theological condemnation.
That was the plan. But Edward sees the outcome as a catastrophic spiritual failure for them. The council didn't stop the Reformation, it just solidified the split.
Instead of moderating, they doubled down.
They did. He says the council was carried headlong. They confirmed the very doctrines the reformers condemned, and in some cases, they made the corruptions even worse than they had been before.
So what's the theological insight there?
Edwards argues that by persisting in their wickedness, even when the reformers offered this clear light from Scripture, they fulfilled the prophecy that they would blaspheme God.
They responded to clarity with more obstinacy.
Yes. And Edwards thinks this was God hardening their hearts or leaving them to harden their own hearts so their later destruction would be entirely justified. In trying to save itself, the Council of Trent just confirmed its own guilt.
Okay, so after the public council, the opposition moved to more clandestine action. Secret plots and conspiracy.
Exactly. There were numerous plots against Luther's life, but Edwards notes he was divinely preserved and died peacefully in his bed.
But he details a much bigger conspiracy.
A much bigger one. A vast, complex scheme during the time of King James II of England. This wasn't local, this was a grand strategic alliance.
Aiming to destroy Protestantism across Europe.
That was the goal. It involved King James II, who was a papist, and the incredibly powerful King Louis XIV of France, also a papist. Their aim was simple, to extirpate the Northern heresy.
And they saw Britain and the Netherlands as the main defenders of the Protestant cause.
Right. If they could bring those regions back under Catholic control, they figured the rest of Protestant Europe would just collapse.
And this plot was very close to succeeding.
It was. Edwards says the scheme seemed fully ripe for execution. But then divine providence, as he puts it, suddenly dashed all their schemes in pieces.
Through the Glorious Revolution of 1688.
That's it. Bringing the Protestant monarchs, William and Mary, to the throne. That one move secured the Protestant interest in Britain and eventually led to the Protestant House of Hanover. It put a legal lock on the system, ensuring no papist could ever wear the English crown again.
So the enemies were groping at noonday again. And this pattern continued.
It did. Edwards points to a later, equally deep plot to bring in the popish pretender during Queen Anne's reign.
The son of King James II.
Right, James Francis Edward Stuart. The plan was to override the Act of Settlement when Anne died and restore the Catholic Stuart line. It was a massive political undertaking that almost worked.
But it was suddenly and totally baffled.
Just like the others. A shift in political power at the moment of Anne's death secured the Hanoverian succession in 1714. Edward sees all these political near misses as direct evidence of a sovereign hand at work.
Okay, the third form of opposition. Open warfare.
This started almost right away. The Emperor of Germany declared war on the princes who favored Luther, aiming to crush the movement militarily. That failed.
Then came the long war between Spain and the Low Countries.
An incredibly cruel war, and it's one of the clearest examples of the opposition just completely backfiring.
How so?
Well, those terrible wars, waged to keep Catholic control, ended up being a huge disadvantage for the Romish Church. The final outcome was the creation of one of the most powerful Protestant states in Europe. the Dutch Republic.
Which then became a major defender of the Protestant cause.
For centuries, it was God turning the enemy's own weapons against them.
And nothing shows the failure of force quite like the Spanish Armada in 1588.
Oh, the intent of that invincible armada was horrific. It was designed to completely root out the Reformed religion from England. They even brought instruments of torture with them for Protestants who wouldn't convert.
But their design was totally baffled.
Completely. The mighty fleet was ruined, mostly by storms and the smaller, faster English ships. A very visible, providential intervention that confirmed England's place as a theological anchor for European Protestantism.
Okay, that brings us to the fourth category, which is maybe the hardest to hear about. Cruel oppression and persecution.
Edwards does not hold back here. He says unequivocally that Antichrist proved to be the greatest and most cruel enemy the church ever had, even worse than the ancient pagan persecutions.
And he's not just using hyperbole.
No, he's talking about the systematization of cruelty. He points to Revelation 17, the woman drunken with the blood of the saints.
And the key shift he highlights is that persecution became a science.
Right. It was improved, studied, and cultivated as an art or science. This led to the courts of Inquisition, which were designed specifically to perfect the methods of persecution, to find new ways of torment.
And the violence escalated as soon as the Reformation began.
Immediately, the Waldenses were targeted again, with multitudes tortured and killed. The suffering was immense, and it was everywhere.
Germany, Bohemia.
Terrible persecutions in Bohemia for 30 years. Edwards says the bloodshed was compared to the great rivers of Germany. The Protestant religion was almost entirely suppressed there, and in the Palatinate and Hungary.
And France was even worse.
Perhaps the most systematic slaughter. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1571 saw 70,000 Protestants killed in just a few days.
And Edwards lists the numbers.
He does. And it's chilling. Over a 30-year period in France, he records the martyrdoms of princes, counts, barons, gentlemen, common people. The numbers are just staggering. He lists them by social class to show it wasn't just the poor who were targeted. It was a systematic attempt to eliminate the entire reformed structure of society.
So how does he process that level of slaughter? Does he see it as a failure of Christ's promise?
Not at all. He sees the sheer scale of the bloodshed as a confirmation of the prophecies about the beast's nature. But he stresses that even with all this, the devil could not ultimately prevail.
The gates of hell shall not prevail against the church.
That's the promise. Even when the church seemed crushed, like in Holland, the result was the exact opposite of what the persecutors wanted.
We also have to remember the persecutions in England under Queen Mary.
Yes, and the later persecutions by high churchmen against the Puritans, which is what led many of our own forefathers to New England, and the terrible bloodshed in Scotland and Ireland.
In Ireland, over 200,000 Protestants were murdered in a few days.
A secret agreement among the papists. The conclusion Edwards draws from all this horror is that while the church was certainly diminished in size, its faith was refined and preserved.
Now we get to the fifth kind of opposition, which is maybe the most insidious.
Because it attacks the doctrine itself, the enemy from within.
Corrupt opinions inside the Reformed faith.
And this started early. The Anabaptists appeared just a few years after Luther. The early German movement was while denying civil authority, advocating rebellion.
They caused so much chaos, it discredited the whole Reformation in the eyes of many leaders.
It did. Then you had the enthusiasts, those who claimed direct inspiration from the Holy Ghost, which led to some very wild behavior. They eventually became the early Quakers in England.
But then the real theological danger arrived. The Socinians.
This was a radical rejection of the core of the gospel. They denied the most fundamental doctrines. They said Christ was just a man, and they completely rejected his substitutionary atonement for sin.
This wasn't a minor disagreement.
No, this was redefining who Christ is and how salvation works. Edwards saw this as the enemy attacking the very foundation of the faith.
Then came the Arminians,
whose views spread incredibly fast. It was an attack on the doctrine of sovereign grace. And even though their views were condemned at the Synod of Dort, they just kept spreading.
especially in the Church of England.
Massively. The divines there had been almost all Calvinists, but by the reign of Charles I, Arminianism had taken over. Edward saw this as a catastrophic shift, undermining God's absolute sovereignty and redemption.
And the slide just continued from there.
It did. You see a revival of Arianism, the idea that Christ is a creature, not God. This started to prevail in England.
And finally, what Edward saw as the biggest challenge to all revealed religion. Deism.
Which just casts off Christianity entirely. Deists believe in a god, some distant creator, but they rely only on human reason and they reject the Bible.
And Edwards laments that this was overrunning England.
The principal nation of the Reformation. So you see this progression of doctrinal error, from denying civil authority to denying Christ's divinity to finally denying revelation itself, a spiritual war fought with intellectual corruption.
So after all that opposition, the failed council, the baffled plots, the ruinous wars, the cruel persecutions, and this internal corrosion of error, how could Edwards possibly find hope?
Because the work of redemption never stops. Even while the Reformed Church was under siege and losing ground, the gospel was advancing in completely new areas.
He categorizes this success into three types.
Right. First is Reformation in countries that were already Christian, but, deeply superstitious. The biggest example for him is the Empire of Muscovy, or Russia.
Which was part of the Greek church, but he describes it as barbarously ignorant.
Exactly. The big change came with Tsar Peter the Great, who started this sweeping reform across his whole territory.
And these were specifically spiritual reforms.
Very intentional. He set up schools, he ordered the Bible to be printed in the common language, and he made a law that every family had to have one.
He even made a law about marriage.
He did, prohibiting marriage until a person could prove they could read the scriptures. I mean, it's a strategic effort to create a literate, biblically formed population.
And what's the result?
The religion practiced in Muscovy moved much closer to the Protestant model, and the country became a land of light, as Edwards puts it, compared to how it had been just 50 years before.
Okay, the second area of success is maybe the most expansive, spreading the gospel among the heathen, starting with the Americas.
Right, this whole continent was unknown to Christians, and this leads Edwards to one of his most fascinating, if speculative, theories.
This is the one about the devil.
Yes. He suggests that when the devil saw the success of the gospel in Constantine's time, he got alarmed. So he led a population of people from the old world into America to hide them from the light of the gospel.
Wait, he thought the devil physically led people across the world to hide them?
It's an audacious idea, isn't it? But it shows how seriously he took the spiritual warfare behind these big geographical events. He believed the devil had quiet dominion over the Indian nations here for ages.
But by Edwards' time, God had intervened in that hidden kingdom.
Right. The Christian church was set up in New England and other parts of America. The land was becoming full of Bibles.
And even though the initial success among the native tribes was small.
And he's honest about that difficulty. He still saw the discovery of America as this massive providential preparation for the future glorious times of the church.
He connected it to technology, too. The mariner's compass.
He did. He saw the compass as a critical invention provided by Providence to enable men to sail the oceans and find new continents, all in preparation for sending the gospel to every corner of the globe.
So God equips the church with the means to fulfill the Great Commission.
That's his view. And beyond America, the gospel was also gaining ground in Muscovy's dominions in Great Tartary.
A huge heathen country.
And because of the political changes in Russia, great numbers there were renouncing heathenism and embracing Christianity.
And he also points to success in the East Indies.
In Malabar, specifically, largely due to Danish missionaries. And crucially, they set up a printing press to produce Bibles and books in the native language.
Which again shows Edwards' emphasis on learning and scripture as the foundation of any real revival.
Exactly. The third type of success he talks about is the revival of religion in its power and practice. He focuses on two recent events.
The first one is in Germany.
Around a man named Augustus Hermann Frank, a professor at Halle, and the revival started with something very small, a charitable design. He put an alms box at his study door to buy books for poor children.
A very humble beginning for a massive spiritual movement.
It was. But God, as Edwards says, wonderfully smiled upon this small design. A spirit of charity was poured out. Frank was able to build public schools and a massive orphan house for nearly 500 children.
And that charitable work fueled a spiritual awakening.
Yes. It was accompanied by a wonderful reformation and revival of religion in Halle, and its influence spread all over Germany. It shows that revival often starts with practical, organized Christian action.
And finally, he points directly to his own audience's experience.
Right. The remarkable outpouring of the Spirit of God they had just witnessed in New England, what we call the Great Awakening. He says they'd be ungrateful not to notice it.
You don't need to describe it to them because they lived through it.
They were eyewitnesses, so despite all the wars and doctrinal decay, the kingdom of Christ was still advancing in these very distinct global ways.
Which brings us to his critical comparison. He looks at his own time, the mid-1700s, and holds it up against the first days of the Reformation.
And he looks honestly at how things were altered, both for the worse and for the better.
Let's start with the bad news. The ways things got worse.
He identifies three primary declines. The first is just the diminished physical size of the Protestant church. That initial half of Christendom was now much smaller.
The territorial losses were severe.
They were. France, which he called a great part of the glory of the Reformation, saw its church utterly broken and scattered. In Germany, several Protestant princes had successors who became papists, so their lands reverted.
In places like Bohemia and Hungary.
Formerly Protestant strongholds, now firmly back in the hands of papists. Geographically, the Protestant cause was not gaining ground against Rome in his day.
Okay, the second decline is maybe more alarming. The breakdown of orthodoxy.
He calls it the prevailing of licentiousness in principles. A great decay in orthodoxy and a lack of zeal for the mysterious and spiritual doctrines of Christianity.
The very doctrines that define the Reformed faith.
Precisely. Justification by faith alone, the sovereign work of the Spirit. These were increasingly held in contempt, especially in England.
So those internal errors we talked about were now a full-blown trend.
They were. He says Arianism, Socinianism, Arminianism, and Deism were carrying almost all before them. He says history has no record of any age with such a great infidel apostasy among people raised under the gospel.
And the result was just widespread scoffing at the gospel.
Unprecedented ridicule, especially among the educated. Which leads to the third decline, the decay of vital piety or godliness.
The First Reformation had this glorious outpouring of the Spirit,
converting multitudes to genuine piety. But by Edwards' time, there was an exceeding great decay of that lived-out religion. If you showed any spiritual fervor, you were dismissed as an enthusiast or a fanatic.
a bleak picture.
He says vice and profaneness were like a flood which threatens to bear down all before it.
But Edwards isn't just a pessimist. The picture isn't entirely dark. He saw ways things were altered for the better.
Right, and this suggests God was setting the stage for something new. The first betterment is the diminished political power of the Pope.
This is a critical point.
It is. Even though the Pope had regained some territory, he had lost a huge amount of influence over the remaining Catholic powers. The vial poured out on the beast's throne was still running, still draining his political authority.
Even popish princes weren't just bowing to Rome anymore.
Not at all. They regarded him only as far as it served their own designs. This is a massive downgrade in respect compared to the Dark Ages. The political structure supporting Antichrist was weaker at its foundation.
The second betterment is less persecution.
It was still happening in some places, but he observed it was in no measure as it was heretofore. The sheer systematic violence was diminishing. He said the spirit of persecution was becoming more out of fashion.
That's a fascinating way to put it. The wickedness shifted channels.
It did. The opposition now ran in a different channel, a spirit of indifferency and ridicule towards all religion rather than fire and sword.
So the church suffered from coldness instead of constant physical torture.
Which Edwards saw as a relative betterment, though he cautions the spirit of Antichrist was just lying dormant.
Okay, and the final, and maybe most important improvement, is the great increase of learning.
Learning had decayed so much during the dark times of popery, but the Reformation and the arc of printing that came before it revived intellectual life. And by Edwards' time, it had reached a height beyond any previous age.
But wait, he just said this learning was being misused by infidels and deists. Why does he count it as a betterment?
Because he sees the increase of learning itself as a good thing. He calls it an excellent handmaid to divinity. He even connects it to prophecy Daniel 12.4, knowledge shall be increased.
So he's hopeful that God is preparing to use this intellectual resource for his own kingdom.
That's his profound conclusion. He sees God repeating a pattern from history.
From before Christ's first coming.
Exactly. Back then, Greco-Roman learning and philosophy reached a great height, but the world, by wisdom, knew not God. Human learning had to reach its peak to show its own utter insufficiency without the gospel.
And now, in the 1700s, the same thing is happening again.
Yes. Learned men trust their own reason, they scorn revelation, they fall into error, they grope in the daytime as in the night, Edwards argues that God is intentionally letting human wisdom run its full course to demonstrate its limits once again.
So the flood of error in his day was actually a necessary prerequisite for the next great revival.
That's his argument. God is letting men prove that even with all their books and knowledge, human reason, when it's elevated above revelation, just leads to error and confusion.
But the purpose is hopeful.
Very hopeful. When God has sufficiently shown the insufficiency of human wisdom, and when the appointed time comes for the glorious pouring out of the Spirit, then God will harness this massive increase of learning.
The intellectual resources will be reclaimed.
They'll be made subservient to religion. All that knowledge will be used for a clear understanding of the Scriptures, for precise theology, and for a glorious defense of the very doctrines that the previous generation had scoffed at.
So printing and learning were God's preparation for the church's future prosperity.
That's how he sees it. This is how the wealth of the wicked is laid up for the just, reclaiming intellectual resources from a generation that misused them for the great work of redemption.
That is a complex and, often terrifying view of history.
Yeah.
But it's all unified by this absolute belief in providence. He's balancing this terrible loss of territory and piety against the weakening of the papal structure and this advent of global knowledge.
What Edwards gives you is a view that historical decline is often just God setting a stage. He puts the decline of piety and the rise of infidelity right alongside the explosion of learning. He doesn't see them as separate problems.
What's a divine sequence?
It is. God allows human reason to run to its limits and fail, which creates a spiritual vacuum. But the result of that failure is this vast store of intellectual resources, learning, printing, global connection, which is then perfectly positioned once the Spirit is poured out to advance Christ's kingdom, not hinder it.
The failure of human reason sets the stage for God's success.
That's the heart of it.
So, if Edwards' premise holds that human wisdom has to be shown to be insufficient before the Spirit works, we have to look at our own time with its information saturation. What does the failure of our modern systems to generate true understanding and the widespread confusion we see everywhere tell us about the proximity of the next great work of redemption?
Thank you for sharing your sources for this deep dive.
And thank you for joining us. We will talk to you next time.